The contract was already on the table when a waitress stepped forward and interrupted a $1 million negotiation. "Sir, your translator is lying." 3 foreign executives stopped speaking mid-sentence. The translator gave a quick, uneasy laugh. And Aaron, the CEO about to sign a deal worth millions, slowly lifted his eyes from the contract in front of him. Because that sentence should never have been spoken in a quiet midtown restaurant. But Becky, the waitress standing beside the table, understood every word the businessman had been saying in German. And what she heard meant someone in that room was about to steal Aaron's company right in front of him. So before we continue, tell me in the comments, if you were Aaron, would you trust the waitress or the professional translator? Because that single moment changed both of their lives. Welcome to the Mr. Graham family, where love, betrayal, secrets, and life-changing truths unfold in every story. If you believe every story carries a lesson, a message, and a moment that stays with you long after it ends, then you're exactly where you belong. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to officially become part of the Mr. Graham family. Now, let's step into today's unforgettable story. Midtown Manhattan had its own rhythm at night. Not the loud chaos people imagined when they thought about New York. This part of the city moved differently after sunset. The sidewalks stayed busy, but the noise softened. Conversations turned quieter. Suits replaced tourist backpacks, and the people stepping through glass restaurant doors usually carried briefcases instead of shopping bags. The restaurant where Becky worked sat between 2 tall office buildings that reflected the lights of the city like mirrors. It wasn't flashy, and that was exactly why certain people preferred it. There were no velvet ropes, no photographers waiting outside. Just polished wooden tables, warm lighting, and the kind of quiet atmosphere where serious conversations could happen without drawing attention. Becky had worked there long enough to understand the pattern of the place. Lunch brought lawyers and financial advisors who checked emails between bites of salad. Dinner brought a different crowd. Executives finishing late meetings. Investors discussing deals. People whose decisions affected companies most citizens had never heard of. Most of them spoke calmly. Soft voices, controlled expressions. But Becky knew better than to assume calm meant simple. She moved through the dining room carrying a tray of glasses, greeting guests with the same warm smile she used every evening. To most customers, she was just another waitress. But Becky watched people carefully. She noticed who spoke first at a table, who stayed quiet, who ordered confidently, and who hesitated. Years of working in restaurants had taught her something interesting about human behavior. People revealed more about themselves when they believed no one important was paying attention, and waitresses were rarely considered important. That suited Becky just fine. She set down 2 glasses of sparkling water at a nearby table and glanced toward the entrance as the front door opened again. 3 men stepped inside. Their suits were expensive in a way that didn't need to show off. Clean lines, dark fabric, the kind of tailoring that meant someone understood exactly how they wanted to appear in a room. Behind them walked a 4th man. He carried a slim leather folder and wore the relaxed confidence of someone who expected to control the conversation. The host greeted them politely and guided the group toward a corner booth near the windows. Becky noticed them immediately, not because wealthy businessmen were unusual in this restaurant, but because the 3 men in front were speaking German. The words floated across the room in quick, measured sentences while they walked toward the table. Becky paused for half a second beside the service station. German. She hadn't heard it spoken casually in the restaurant before. Most foreign guests switched to English during business meetings. These men didn't. Becky picked up a stack of menus and approached the table. The moment she stepped closer, she saw the man sitting opposite the 3 visitors. Aaron. She didn't know his name yet, but something about him stood out immediately. He looked slightly younger than the others, maybe mid-30s, dressed in a dark jacket with the sleeves pushed up just enough to suggest he had been working all day. He wasn't talking when she arrived. Instead, he listened carefully while the other men spoke. That detail caught Becky's attention. People who listened more than they spoke usually carried real authority. She placed the menus gently on the table. "Good evening," she said. Aaron looked up first and offered a polite smile. "Thank you." His voice carried the calm tone of someone used to long negotiations. The man seated beside him, the one holding the leather folder, spoke next. "This meeting will be conducted in German," he explained to the group before glancing briefly toward Becky. Then he added in English, "I will translate." Becky nodded politely. "Of course." She stepped away from the table. But as she walked toward the kitchen, she could still hear pieces of the conversation drifting through the room. German words moved quickly between the three visitors. Then the translator repeated their statements in English for Aaron. Becky kept walking. At first, she didn't think much about it. But the moment she reached the counter where the kitchen staff prepared plates, something small caught her attention. A sentence. One of the German visitors had mentioned a delivery timeline. Becky remembered the exact number he said. 3 months. Yet when the translator repeated the statement in English, he calmly said, 6 months. Becky stopped moving for a moment. Her first thought was simple. Maybe she heard it wrong. Restaurant noise could distort words. Dishes clattered in the kitchen. A nearby table laughed loudly. She told herself it was probably nothing. Still, something about the moment stayed in her mind. When she returned to the dining room carrying another tray, she passed the table again. The conversation continued. German sentences, then the translator's English version. Becky slowed slightly as she walked past. Another number appeared in the discussion, a percentage connected to distribution rights. The German visitor explained it clearly, but the translator changed the phrasing when he spoke, not drastically, just enough to soften the meaning. Becky felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. Now she knew she hadn't imagined the first difference. She continued walking, setting down a plate at another table. Maybe it was business terminology, she thought. Contracts use complicated language. Maybe the translator was simplifying the message. That explanation made sense, but something about the tone of the German conversation made Becky uneasy. Because the men across from Aaron weren't speaking like people who expected their words to be softened. They were speaking precisely, carefully, and every time they finished a sentence, the translator adjusted the meaning slightly. Becky returned to the service counter and picked up a cloth to wipe her hands. Her heart beat a little faster now. She glanced across the dining room toward the corner booth. Aaron sat calmly, listening to the translation, occasionally nodding while he reviewed the documents inside the folder. From his perspective, the conversation probably sounded completely clear, but Becky understood enough German to notice the difference between what was said and what was repeated, and the gap between those two things was starting to grow. She told herself to stay focused on work. This wasn't her meeting. These weren't her contracts. Still, as the conversation continued across the room, Becky felt a quiet realization settle in the back of her mind. Something about that negotiation wasn't right. And if the pattern she was hearing continued, Aaron might be making decisions based on information that wasn't completely true. Becky tried to focus on the other tables. A couple near the window needed refills. A man at the bar asked for another espresso. 2 co-workers sharing a late dinner waved her over to ask about the dessert menu. Normal restaurant work, simple tasks that usually kept her mind busy. But tonight, something kept pulling her attention back toward the corner booth where Aaron and the German guests were seated. Every time she walked past the table, pieces of the conversation reached her ears. German first, then the English translation. At first, the differences had been small enough to ignore. Slight adjustments in tone or phrasing. But now the pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. Becky placed a small plate of cheesecake in front of a customer and thanked him politely. As she turned away, she heard the German client nearest Aaron speak again. The man's voice was steady and direct. Becky understood the sentence clearly. He was discussing the delivery timeline again. 3 months. The words were unmistakable. The man even emphasized the number, repeating it once more as he explained the production schedule. Becky slowed slightly as she passed the table with a tray in her hands. She waited to hear the translation. The translator smiled politely and turned toward Aaron. "The delivery timeline will be 6 months," he said smoothly. Becky stopped walking. Not completely, just enough for her body to hesitate before continuing forward. 6 months. Again. The same change. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Numbers in business contracts were not casual details. Deadlines determined production schedules, distribution plans, and financial penalties. Changing 3 months to 6 months could shift entire business strategies. Becky placed the tray down at the service station near the kitchen and leaned against the counter for a moment. Her mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe the translator misunderstood the German, but that seemed unlikely. The sentence had been simple, clear. Even someone with basic language training would have recognized the number. Maybe the clients meant something else. Maybe the translator was clarifying context. But that explanation didn't hold up either, because Becky had heard the same type of change earlier when percentages were discussed. The pattern was repeating. Her eyes drifted across the dining room again. Aaron was reading through the contract documents while the translator spoke calmly beside him. The 3 German clients sat across the table, nodding politely. From Aaron's perspective, everything probably appeared smooth and professional. Becky felt a quiet wave of unease settle in her stomach. If Aaron believed the translation, then the contract in front of him might not match what the clients were actually agreeing to. And if that happened, he could sign something completely different from what he thought he was negotiating. Becky rubbed her hands together nervously. This wasn't her business. She was a waitress, not part of the meeting. Interrupting a table like that could easily get her in trouble. High-level clients expected privacy, professionalism, silence from staff unless they were serving food. Her manager had reminded the staff of that rule many times. Stay polite. Stay invisible. Don't involve yourself in customer conversations. Becky looked toward the kitchen where the manager stood speaking with one of the cooks. Everything in the restaurant continued normally. No one else had noticed anything unusual. Only her. She exhaled slowly and picked up another tray. Maybe she should ignore it. Maybe the translator knew something she didn't. Maybe the difference didn't matter. But as she walked back into the dining room, another sentence reached her ears. This time the German client spoke more firmly. Becky caught the words instantly. He was referencing penalties connected to the delivery deadline. If the 3-month timeline was missed, the agreement allowed the other company to adjust the profit distribution. It was a protective clause, standard business language. But when the translator repeated the statement in English, he removed that detail entirely. Becky felt the moment land inside her chest like a weight. Now she understood what was happening. The translator wasn't simply adjusting words. He was removing conditions that protected Aaron. The room suddenly felt warmer. Her pulse quickened. Across the restaurant, Aaron leaned back slightly in his chair, thinking through the discussion while reviewing the contract pages. He trusted what he was hearing. Of course he did. That was the entire purpose of hiring a translator. Becky stood beside a nearby table pretending to wipe the surface while her mind argued with itself. Stay quiet. This isn't your responsibility. If you interrupt them and you're wrong, you'll embarrass yourself and possibly lose your job. But another thought pushed back just as strongly. What if she was right? What if the translator was changing the meaning intentionally? If Aaron signed that contract believing the translation, the consequences could be enormous. Becky remembered something her grandmother used to say when she was younger. It had happened during a family dinner years ago. 2 relatives were arguing loudly about a misunderstanding. Everyone else at the table stayed quiet, hoping the argument would resolve itself. But Becky's grandmother had stepped between them and spoken calmly. Silence doesn't solve problems, she said. It just gives them room to grow. The memory returned now with surprising clarity. Becky looked back toward Aaron's table again. He had picked up a pen. The contract folder lay open in front of him. The translator leaned slightly closer, continuing the explanation of the agreement terms. No one else in the restaurant understood what was happening. No one except Becky. Her heart pounded harder now. This moment would pass quickly. In a few seconds, Aaron might sign the document. And once that happened, it would be too late to question the conversation. Becky took a slow breath. Her hands felt colder than before. One thought settled firmly in her mind. If she walked away now, she would always remember that moment. She would remember hearing the truth and choosing not to speak. Becky straightened her shoulders. Then she stepped away from the table she had been wiping and walked toward the corner booth. The 4 men noticed her approach. Aaron looked up first, expecting a routine interruption, perhaps a refill or a question about their order. But Becky stopped beside the table and spoke before she could lose her nerve. Her voice came out steady, though her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Sir, the word made everyone pause. Aaron lifted his eyes toward her. The translator turned his head, and Becky finished the sentence that would change the entire evening. Your translator is lying. For a moment, the table didn't react. The sentence Becky had spoken hung in the air like a sudden crack of thunder in a quiet room. Sir, your translator is lying. The words were calm, but their meaning landed heavily. Aaron slowly lifted his eyes from the contract in front of him. He looked at Becky. Not angry, not confused, just surprised. Across the table, the 3 German businessmen stopped moving entirely. One of them still held a glass halfway to his lips, frozen mid-motion. The translator reacted first. He let out a quick laugh. a short, tight sound that didn't quite match the relaxed confidence he had been showing all evening. Aaron turned his head toward him. The translator shrugged lightly and spoke with a smooth voice. "Sometimes staff misunderstand foreign conversations," he said. "It happens." His tone carried the polite dismissal of someone closing a minor inconvenience. Then he glanced toward Becky. It wasn't a friendly look. It was a kind of expression that said clearly, "You are out of place here." Becky felt the tension immediately, but she didn't step back. Aaron noticed that. Most people would have apologized by now. They would have backed away from the table, embarrassed by interrupting a business discussion. Becky didn't. She stood still beside the booth. Aaron leaned back slightly in his chair and studied her face. "You speak German?" he asked. Becky nodded once. "Yes." The translator moved quickly. "Business German can be very complicated," he said. It's possible she heard a few words and assumed the meaning. Aaron raised a finger. A small gesture. But the translator stopped talking instantly. Aaron's eyes moved back to Becky. "What did you hear?" he asked. Becky felt every pair of eyes at the table on her now. The restaurant noise around them continued normally. Plates clinked. Conversations carried on. A quiet jazz track played through the speakers. But inside the circle of that booth, the atmosphere had changed completely. Becky spoke carefully. "The man across from you said the delivery timeline is 3 months. Aaron blinked once. The translator shifted slightly beside him, but Becky continued. "You were told 6. Aaron turned slowly toward the German businessman sitting across from him. He spoke a short sentence in English. 3 months? The German client answered immediately in German. Aaron didn't look at the translator this time. Instead, he looked at Becky. She listened closely. Then she nodded. He confirmed 3 months, she said. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The translator cleared his throat. There may have been a misunderstanding of context. Aaron raised his hand again. The translator stopped speaking. Aaron leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His voice stayed calm. "Let's try something simple." He looked at Becky. "Translate the next thing they say." The German businessman exchanged a brief look with the other 2 men before speaking again. His tone was slower now, more careful. Becky listened. Then she translated. "He says the contract includes a revenue percentage adjustment if the delivery deadline is missed." Aaron's eyebrows pulled together. He turned to the translator. "Did you mention that?" The translator hesitated. Only a second, but that second told Aaron everything. "No," the translator admitted quietly. Across the table, the German businessmen began speaking among themselves. Their expressions were no longer polite. They looked confused, concerned, because they were starting to understand what had been happening during the conversation. Aaron picked up the contract folder and flipped through several pages. His eyes moved quickly across the printed clauses. Then he closed the folder slowly. The soft sound of paper settling echoed across the table. Aaron stood up. The movement was calm, deliberate, but final. "This meeting is finished," he said. The translator's head snapped toward him. "Aaron, I think we should clarify." Aaron looked at him. Just one look. The translator stopped mid-sentence. Aaron turned toward the 3 German businessmen and spoke politely. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said. "But we will need to review the terms again before continuing." The men nodded slowly. They stood, shook Aaron's hand, and collected their documents. Their expressions showed disappointment, but not anger. Within a minute, they were walking toward the restaurant exit. The translator remained seated for a moment longer. He adjusted his tie and gathered his folder. "Miscommunications happen," he said stiffly. Aaron didn't answer. He simply watched him. After a few seconds, the translator stood and left the table. He walked out of the restaurant quickly, without looking back. The tension disappeared almost as suddenly as it had arrived. The surrounding tables continued their conversations, unaware that $1 million agreement had just collapsed in the corner booth. Becky stood beside the table, suddenly aware of how unusual the situation looked. Her hands trembled slightly now that the adrenaline had started to fade. Aaron looked at the closed contract folder in front of him. Then he looked up at Becky. For a moment, he didn't speak. Finally, he said quietly, "You may have just saved me a very expensive mistake." Becky shrugged, softly. "I only repeated what I heard." Aaron studied her for another second. Then he let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "Still," he said, Most people would have stayed quiet. Becky gave a small smile. Maybe, she replied. Then, she added, but if you were about to sign something that didn't match the conversation, I figured you'd want to know. Aaron nodded slowly. The realization settled in his mind. If Becky hadn't stepped forward, he would have signed that contract believing the translation was accurate, and the consequences might not have been discovered for months. He looked at her again, this time with a different kind of curiosity, because the waitress who had just interrupted his business meeting had done something very few people in his world ever did. She told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. Before we continue the story, let me ask you something. If you were Becky in that moment, would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed quiet and protected your job? Let me know in the comments. For several seconds after the translator left the restaurant, Becky remained standing beside the table. The room around her sounded exactly the same as before. Silverware touched plates. A quiet conversation drifted from a nearby table. Someone near the bar laughed softly, but inside Becky's chest, everything still felt tense. Her hands were trembling slightly. She looked down at the empty glasses on the table and reached for them automatically, trying to return to the routine of her job. Clear the table, reset the place settings, move on to the next guests. Except this time, it didn't feel like an ordinary table. Aaron was still sitting there. He hadn't moved since the translator walked out. The closed contract folder rested in front of him. Becky picked up 2 glasses and placed them carefully on her tray. For the first time since she had spoken, doubt crept into her mind. Had she crossed a line? Interrupting a private negotiation between executives was not something waitresses usually did. Her manager had always been clear about one rule: respect the guest's space, and Becky had just stepped directly into the middle of it. She lowered her eyes toward the table while wiping a small ring of water from the surface. If the manager found out what happened, she might be called into the office before the night ended. Aaron's voice interrupted her thoughts. You know, he said quietly, most people wouldn't have done that. Becky looked up. Aaron was watching her carefully. There was no anger in his expression, just curiosity. She placed the cloth down slowly. I wasn't trying to interrupt your meeting, she said. Aaron shook his head slightly. I know. He leaned back in the booth and tapped the closed folder with his fingers. If you hadn't said something, he continued, I would have signed that contract. Becky gave a small shrug. I just heard a difference in what was being said. Aaron studied her face again. You didn't sound unsure when you spoke. That's because I wasn't. The answer came out naturally. For a moment, Aaron smiled. It wasn't a loud laugh, just the kind of smile that appears when someone appreciates honesty. You speak German well, he said. Becky nodded. I studied languages in college. Aaron raised an eyebrow. College? Yes. German? And French. Spanish too. Aaron sat up a little straighter. That clearly wasn't the answer he expected from someone wearing a restaurant apron. So, you studied languages, he said slowly. Becky nodded again. For a few years. Aaron glanced toward the restaurant entrance where the translator had disappeared earlier. Then he looked back at Becky. You caught every difference? Not every word, Becky replied. But the important ones. Aaron leaned forward now, interested. Like what? Becky hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke calmly. The delivery timeline. Aaron nodded. 3 months instead of 6. And the percentage clause? Aaron's expression shifted slightly. That one bothered me, he admitted. The translator never mentioned it. Becky crossed her arms lightly. He skipped it. Aaron's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Skipped it, he repeated. The realization settled deeper in his mind. Someone had tried to guide that negotiation in a direction he never agreed to. And if Becky hadn't stepped in, he would have signed the deal believing everything was accurate. Aaron looked back at her again. You saved me a lot of trouble tonight. Becky gave a small laugh. I didn't think about it like that. How did you think about it? She shrugged again. I just thought, if I were sitting at that table, I'd want someone to tell me. Aaron nodded slowly. That answer felt sincere. There was no attempt to impress him, no hint that she expected anything in return. Just a simple explanation. Aaron tapped the table once before standing up. He closed the contract folder and tucked it under his arm. Then he looked at Becky again. What time do you finish your shift? Becky blinked. That's an unusual question. Aaron smiled. I ask unusual questions sometimes. She glanced toward the kitchen briefly before answering. About 30 minutes. Aaron nodded. Good. Becky raised an eyebrow. Why? Aaron slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat. Because I'd like to hear the rest of the story. What story? The one about how someone who studies 3 languages ends up correcting million-dollar negotiations in a midtown restaurant. Becky laughed quietly. That's a long story. Aaron smiled again. I've got time. For the first time since the tension at the table had begun, Becky felt the atmosphere lighten. The crisis was over, but something new had just started. A conversation between 2 people who had come from very different worlds. And neither of them realized yet how much that conversation was about to matter. 30 minutes later, Becky untied the apron strings behind her back and hung the fabric neatly on the hook in the staff room. Her shift was finished. Normally, the end of a long evening at the restaurant brought the same familiar feeling. Tired feet, quiet relief, a short subway ride home. But tonight felt different. Her mind kept replaying the moment at the table, the silence after she spoke, Aaron closing the contract folder, the translator leaving the restaurant without another word. Becky grabbed her coat and stepped out through the back hallway that led to the street. The night air in Midtown was cooler than it had been earlier. The sidewalks were still active, but the rush of dinner crowds had begun to thin. Cars moved slowly between the traffic lights. Office windows glowed high above the street like small squares of light stacked into the sky. Becky wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders and stepped onto the sidewalk. Aaron was standing near the entrance of the restaurant. He looked up when he saw her. You made it, he said. Becky raised an eyebrow. You waited. Aaron shrugged. I said I would. She walked over, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Becky glanced down the street. So, she said casually, what happens now? Aaron followed her gaze toward the line of buildings stretching along the avenue. I thought we could walk. Becky smiled slightly. That's a very New York answer. Aaron laughed. It's also the easiest way to talk without being interrupted. They started walking south along the sidewalk together. The city at night had a different energy than during the day. Delivery trucks rolled past slowly. A subway rumble vibrated faintly beneath the pavement. Street vendors packed up carts while a few late customers ordered snacks before heading home. Becky noticed Aaron walking at the same relaxed pace she was. Not rushing, not checking his phone every few seconds like many of the business people she served at the restaurant. You're quieter than I expected, she said. Aaron looked over. What did you expect? I don't know, Becky admitted. Someone running a big company probably spends a lot of time talking. Aaron smiled. That's true. So why aren't you talking? Aaron glanced ahead at the streetlight turning green. Because I spent the whole evening doing that. They crossed the intersection together. A small coffee cart stood on the corner, its metal frame glowing under a portable light. Aaron paused. Coffee? Becky nodded. I won't say no to that. Aaron ordered 2 cups. The vendor handed them over with a quick nod before turning back to another customer. Aaron passed 1 cup to Becky. Their fingers brushed briefly as she took it. Becky took a sip and exhaled softly. That's better. They continued walking. After a few minutes, Aaron spoke again. So tell me, he said, how did you end up working in that restaurant? Becky glanced at him sideways. You're asking the long story. You warned me earlier it was long. She smiled. Fair enough. They walked another block before Becky began. I grew up in Brooklyn, she said. Aaron nodded, listening. My family wasn't rich, she continued, but our apartment was always full of people, cousins, neighbors, someone's friend who needed dinner. Aaron smiled faintly. That sounds busy. It was loud, Becky said, laughing. But it was good. She took another sip of coffee. My grandmother used to say you learn more by listening than by talking. Aaron glanced at her. That explains tonight. Becky shrugged. Maybe. She continued walking before adding, I liked languages when I was younger, the way people from different places explain the same idea with different words. So, you studied them. Yeah. Aaron waited for her to continue. But college isn't cheap, Becky said. So, when money got tight, I started working nights. At the restaurant? Exactly. Aaron looked thoughtful. You ever plan to go back to it? Becky smiled. I never really stopped. Aaron raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? When my shift ends, Becky explained, I sit at the counter sometimes and read international news. Aaron laughed softly. You read business news after work? Sometimes. Aaron shook his head. That might be the first time I've heard that from someone in the restaurant business. Becky looked at him curiously. What about you? Aaron looked ahead at the traffic moving down the avenue. My story isn't that exciting. I doubt that. Aaron took a slow breath. My father worked construction, he said. My mother taught elementary school. Becky listened quietly. We lived outside the city, Aaron continued. Nothing fancy, just a normal neighborhood. So, how did you end up running a company? Aaron smiled slightly. I asked a lot of questions. That's it? That's how it started. They stopped at another crosswalk while cars passed in front of them. Aaron continued. I started a small tech platform a few years ago. Logistics, supply chains, shipping coordination. Becky nodded. And it worked. Eventually, Aaron chuckled. The first year felt like I was trying to build something out of nothing. Becky studied his expression. You didn't give up? Aaron shook his head. No. The traffic light changed and they crossed the street again. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The city noise filled the space between them. Finally, Becky said something quietly. You know something funny? Aaron looked over. What? If I hadn't been working tonight, she said, we never would have met. Aaron smiled. That's true. They walked another few steps before he added, and if you hadn't spoken up. He didn't finish the sentence. But Becky understood. Aaron glanced down at the coffee cup in his hand. Then he looked back at her. You know, he said, I'm glad you did. Becky smiled softly. Me too. For the first time since they left the restaurant, the conversation felt easy. Like two people who had come from very different lives discovering they understood each other more than expected. Neither of them noticed Aaron's phone vibrating quietly inside his coat pocket. But the message waiting on that screen was about to change the tone of the entire night. And Becky was about to realize that speaking up earlier might have disrupted a plan far bigger than a simple contract mistake. Aaron felt the vibration in his coat pocket as they continued walking down the sidewalk. At first he ignored it. Late messages were normal in his line of work. Emails from investors, questions from employees in different time zones, requests that rarely waited until morning. But the phone vibrated again, then once more. Becky noticed the small movement in his pocket and glanced toward him. Your phone sounds determined, she said lightly. Aaron smiled faintly. That usually means someone thinks something is urgent. Then you should probably check it. Aaron pulled the phone from his pocket and looked down at the screen. The expression on his face changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for Becky to notice. Bad news? She asked. Aaron didn't answer right away. His eyes moved slowly across the message. Then he exhaled quietly. It's from my legal team, he said. Becky leaned slightly closer, curious, but careful not to intrude. And Aaron looked back at the screen again before speaking. They've been reviewing the contract from tonight. Becky nodded. That makes sense. Aaron lowered the phone slightly. They found something interesting. The tone of his voice had shifted, more serious now. Becky could hear it immediately. What kind of interesting? She asked. Aaron stopped walking. They were standing near a quiet stretch of sidewalk where the glow from a nearby streetlight reflected off the pavement. Aaron turned the phone toward her. I'll summarize it, he said. Becky listened closely. The translator tonight wasn't hired randomly, Aaron explained. He came recommended through a consulting contact. Becky frowned slightly. That doesn't sound unusual. It didn't seem unusual to me either, Aaron replied. He paused before continuing. But my legal team just traced that recommendation. Becky's brow tightened. And Aaron slipped the phone back into his pocket. It leads back to a company that competes directly with mine. Becky blinked. You mean? Aaron nodded slowly. The translator may have been working for them. The words settled heavily between them. Becky looked back toward the street they had just walked down, as if replaying the entire evening in her mind. So the changes in the translation weren't accidents, she said quietly. Aaron shook his head. That's what it looks like. He crossed his arms and looked toward the traffic moving through the intersection ahead. The clauses he skipped, Aaron continued, would have protected my company if the delivery schedule changed. Becky remembered the sentence she translated earlier. The percentage adjustment, she said. Exactly. Aaron nodded. If that clause disappeared during the negotiation, the final contract could have given the other side leverage over my distribution network. Becky felt the weight of the idea immediately, meaning they could control how your product moves. Aaron looked at her, impressed. Yes, Becky folded her arms slightly. And that's worth a lot of money. Aaron gave a quiet laugh. More than a lot. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them. Cars passed through the intersection. A subway train rumbled faintly beneath the street somewhere below. Finally, Becky said what both of them were thinking. So someone wanted you to sign a contract that looked normal, but actually gave them control later. Aaron nodded. That's the conclusion my legal team is reaching. Becky let out a slow breath. That's not a small mistake. No, Aaron agreed. It isn't. He looked at her again. And if you hadn't interrupted that meeting, he didn't finish the sentence. But the meaning was obvious. Becky stared down at the sidewalk for a moment. Her earlier decision suddenly felt much bigger than she expected. I thought I was correcting a translation, she said quietly. Aaron shook his head. You stopped something very deliberate. Becky looked back up. You think someone planned that whole situation? Aaron answered carefully. It would explain a lot. He paused, the translator changing key details, the pressure to finalize the deal tonight, the way the other side pushed the timeline. Becky's stomach tightened slightly. So this wasn't just about one meeting. No. Aaron looked out across the street again. It looks like someone wanted my company in a weaker position. The realization hung in the air. Becky suddenly felt a chill run down her arms. If that's true, she said slowly. Aaron finished the thought. Then someone is probably unhappy that the plan didn't work. They stood quietly for a few seconds. Becky replayed the moment in the restaurant again, the translator's quick laugh, the uncomfortable pause when Aaron tested the translation, the way the man left the table so quickly once the conversation changed. Her voice lowered slightly. You think he knew I understood German? Aaron shook his head. Probably not. Then he didn't expect anyone to challenge him. That would be my guess. Becky looked up at the tall buildings around them. A few windows still glowed with late-night office lights. For the first time that evening, she felt the larger picture forming. What started as a quiet dinner meeting had been part of something far more calculated, and her decision to speak had disrupted it. Aaron studied her expression. You didn't know any of this when you said something, he said. Becky shook her head. No. Aaron gave a small nod. That's probably why you said it. Becky tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Aaron smiled faintly. If you had known the size of the situation, you might have hesitated. Becky thought about that. Then she shook her head again. Actually, she said, I probably still would have said it. Aaron looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed softly. Good, he said. Becky raised an eyebrow. Why good? Aaron slipped his hands back into his coat pockets as they started walking again. Because honesty like that is hard to find. They continued down the sidewalk together, but the night no longer felt like a simple walk after dinner. Now both of them understood something important. Becky hadn't just interrupted a conversation. She had disrupted someone's expensive plan, and whoever had arranged that plan might not appreciate the interference. The next morning arrived quietly. For Becky, the day started like most others. The subway platform smelled faintly of coffee and metal as trains moved through the station with their usual rhythm. Commuters stood in loose lines along the edge of the platform, staring at phones or watching the tracks. Nothing about the morning suggested that anything unusual had happened the night before. Becky leaned against one of the metal pillars and thought about the conversation she had with Aaron after her shift. The message from his legal team kept replaying in her mind. Someone had tried to manipulate a major business agreement, and her decision to speak up had interrupted it. At the time, it felt like a single moment in a restaurant. Now it seemed like the first step into something much larger. The subway train arrived with a rush of wind, and Becky stepped inside with the rest of the passengers. She still had another evening shift ahead of her. Life moved forward whether something important happened or not. Across the city, Aaron's morning looked very different. He arrived at his office earlier than usual. The building was quiet when he walked through the entrance. Only a few lights were on across the upper floors. Aaron unlocked his office door and set the contract folder on his desk. The same folder he almost signed the night before. He opened it slowly. The printed pages inside looked harmless at first glance. Clean paragraphs, carefully structured clauses. Nothing about the document appeared unusual unless someone studied the language carefully. Aaron sat down and opened his laptop. Within minutes, he was reviewing the reports sent by his legal team. They had already started examining the contract line by line. Several details immediately stood out. One clause quietly adjusted delivery obligations if deadlines changed. Another clause modified revenue percentages if distribution timelines shifted. Individually, each clause looked normal, but together they created a very specific outcome. If Aaron's company missed the adjusted delivery schedule, control of certain logistics decisions could move to the other side of the agreement. Aaron leaned back in his chair. That control would affect his entire distribution network. Warehouses, shipping routes, supplier timelines, everything connected. The more he studied the document, the clearer the situation became. The translation differences Becky noticed were not random. They were targeted. Without the accurate clauses explained during the meeting, Aaron would never realize what he was agreeing to until months later. And by then, the contract would already be binding. Aaron closed the folder again and looked out the office window. Someone had spent time designing that trap. Later that afternoon, another update arrived from his legal team. Aaron read the message carefully. The translator from the meeting had not responded to any calls or emails. His contact information appeared legitimate, but his consulting profile had already been removed from several professional directories. The disappearance was immediate. Too immediate. Aaron understood what that meant. The translator had never planned to remain available after the meeting. That realization confirmed what Aaron suspected. This was not a simple misunderstanding. It was an attempt to sabotage his company's next major deal. Aaron rubbed his forehead slowly. Business competition was normal. Companies tried to outmaneuver each other every day. But manipulating translation inside a negotiation crossed into something much more aggressive. Aaron leaned forward and opened another file. If someone had tried once, they might try again, which meant the real problem might not be the translator who disappeared. The real problem might be someone who understood Aaron's company well enough to design the trap, someone with access to information. That thought made Aaron pause. He looked around his office quietly. Trust inside a business mattered, but trust could also create blind spots. Aaron closed the laptop and stood up. From this point forward, he would need to watch every negotiation more carefully. Meanwhile, Becky's day followed a completely different rhythm. She returned to the restaurant that evening and tied her apron around her waist the same way she always did. The dining room filled slowly as the dinner crowd arrived. Orders moved from the kitchen to the tables. Guests talked about work, travel, and weekend plans. From the outside, nothing about Becky's evening looked unusual. But every once in a while, she found herself thinking about the previous night. The contract. The translator. Aaron's reaction when the truth became clear. Becky placed a plate of food in front of a customer and stepped back toward the service counter. Something about the entire situation still lingered in her thoughts. She didn't fully understand the business details Aaron described, but one thing felt clear. The meeting in the restaurant had not been random. Someone had expected Aaron to sign that agreement, and the moment Becky spoke up had disrupted something very carefully planned. Across town, Aaron stared at the contract folder once more before placing it inside a locked drawer. The investigation had only just begun. But one fact was already clear. The meeting at the restaurant was only the first move in a much larger game. 3 days passed after the night at the restaurant. For Becky, life returned to a routine that looked almost identical to the week before. She woke up late in the morning, made coffee in the small kitchen of her Brooklyn apartment, and spent a quiet hour reading through articles on her phone before getting ready for work. Most of the headlines she read had nothing to do with her life. International trade updates, technology partnerships between companies on different continents, shipping delays affecting supply chains across Europe. Becky read them the way some people read sports scores, not because she needed the information, because she enjoyed understanding how decisions made in conference rooms could ripple outward into the real world. Still, every now and then, her mind drifted back to the restaurant, to the moment she stepped up to Aaron's table, and the way the entire conversation changed after she spoke. She hadn't seen Aaron since that night. The city was too big for chance encounters, and she assumed he had returned to the world of boardrooms and negotiations that people like him lived in every day. Becky finished her coffee and set the mug in the sink. Another work shift waited later that evening. Across Manhattan, Aaron was dealing with the consequences of that same night. His office had become quieter over the past few days, not because the company had slowed down, because Aaron had started paying attention to details he once trusted others to handle. Contracts, meeting summaries, translated documents. The investigation into the failed deal was continuing, but one frustrating detail remained unchanged. The translator had completely disappeared. No returned calls, no professional listings. Even the consulting agency that originally suggested his services claimed they had no further contact information. Aaron closed the report on his screen. The situation confirmed something he had been thinking about since the restaurant meeting. If the translation had been slightly different, if Becky had not spoken up, he might never have known what he signed. Aaron leaned back in his chair. That thought kept returning. Becky had understood the conversation faster than the hired translator. Not only that, she recognized how the wording affected the contract itself, which meant her understanding of language went beyond casual conversation. She understood meaning, context, implication. Aaron reached for his phone. A few seconds later, Becky's phone vibrated inside her apron pocket as she was setting glasses at the restaurant. She stepped briefly into the service hallway and checked the screen. Aaron. Becky blinked once, surprised, before answering. Hello? Hi, Aaron said. His voice sounded calm, the same way it had during their walk through the city. I hope I'm not interrupting your shift. Becky glanced toward the dining room. I've got a few minutes, she replied. What's up? Aaron hesitated slightly. I've been reviewing some translated documents this week. Becky leaned against the wall. That sounds like your normal work. It is, Aaron said. But something occurred to me. What? Aaron spoke carefully. The way you noticed the differences during that meeting. It wasn't just about knowing German. Becky smiled faintly. You noticed that you understood how the wording affected the deal, Aaron continued. Becky thought for a moment before answering. Language shapes agreements, she said. One word can change responsibility. Aaron nodded, even though she couldn't see him. That's exactly the problem I'm dealing with right now. Becky raised an eyebrow. What kind of problem? Aaron looked down at a stack of documents on his desk. My team has been reviewing international partnership proposals, he said. Most of them include translated sections. And you think something might be hidden inside the wording, Becky said. Aaron smiled slightly. Yes. Becky crossed her arms. So, why are you calling me? Aaron answered honestly. Because you caught something professionals missed. Becky laughed quietly. That might have been luck. I don't think it was, Aaron said. He paused briefly. I'm not offering a job or anything official, he added. Just asking if you'd be willing to look at a few documents and tell me if anything feels off. Becky thought about the idea for a moment. Her shift was about to continue. She was still wearing her apron. Yet the conversation suddenly placed her inside a world she had only watched from a distance. You want a waitress reviewing your business documents? She said. Aaron chuckled. I want someone who notices things. Becky smiled slightly. That's a different job description. Aaron leaned forward in his chair. Think of it as a second opinion. She considered the offer. What would I actually be looking for? She asked. Aaron flipped through the stack of papers on his desk. Subtle shifts in language, he said. Clauses that sound harmless but carry bigger meaning. Becky nodded slowly. Legal phrasing. Exactly. And translated wording that changes responsibility between parties. Aaron's eyebrows lifted slightly. Yes. Becky was quiet for a second before answering. All right. Aaron sat up straighter. That means yes. It means I'll look, Becky said. But if I don't understand something, I'll say that too. That's all I'm asking. Becky glanced back toward the dining room again. I've got to get back to work. Of course, Aaron replied. We'll figure out a time later. Becky ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. For a moment she stood there thinking. Helping analyze international business documents was not something she ever imagined doing. Yet something about the idea excited her. Because language had always been more than vocabulary to her. It was structure, logic, meaning hidden inside words. Later that evening, Aaron reviewed the same documents again. But this time, he felt slightly more confident. Because someone outside his usual circle would be looking at them too. And Becky had already proven something important. She noticed patterns other people overlooked. Aaron didn't realize it yet. But Becky's insight was about to reveal something hidden inside his contracts that would change the direction of the investigation completely. The following week began normally for Aaron's company. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. The office floors filled with employees arriving early for meetings, screens lit up across workstations. Conversations about shipping schedules and logistics updates moved through conference rooms. Aaron walked through the office quietly, greeting people with short nods as he headed toward his workspace. Nothing about the morning suggested trouble, but inside his office, the situation looked different. Aaron sat down and opened a file containing several upcoming partnership negotiations. These were agreements his company had been preparing for months. International supply routes, warehouse expansions, regional distribution partnerships. Each deal had the potential to strengthen the company's network. Normally, Aaron approached these negotiations with confidence, but now something about them felt uncertain. He opened the first document and scanned the latest update from his team. The negotiation had stalled overnight. The partner company suddenly requested new conditions. Aaron frowned. Unexpected changes happened in business, but the timing felt strange. He opened another file. That negotiation had also slowed down. The other company wanted to delay the final agreement. Aaron leaned back in his chair. Two unrelated deals stalling at the same time was unusual. Still, it could be coincidence. He moved to the third file. This time the message was shorter. The negotiation had collapsed completely. The other company decided to withdraw from the agreement. Aaron stared at the screen. 3 deals, 3 unexpected disruptions, and all of them appeared within the same week. He closed the laptop slowly. Across the city, Becky sat at a small table inside her apartment with a stack of printed documents Aaron had sent earlier that afternoon. The papers were spread across the table in neat rows. Some contained original German text. Others included English translations prepared by Aaron's legal team. Becky leaned forward slightly as she read through the first section. At first glance, the wording looked correct, but Becky wasn't reading for vocabulary. She was reading for intention. There was a difference. Certain phrases in legal agreements carried subtle responsibilities. Small adjustments could change who carried risk if something went wrong. Becky circled a sentence with a pen. Then she read the same paragraph again in the translated version. The translation was technically correct, but the tone was slightly different. The responsibility for delivery delays shifted from shared responsibility to a heavier obligation on Aaron's company. Becky leaned back in her chair. The difference was small enough that many people would miss it, but after what happened at the restaurant, Becky trusted her instincts. She picked up her phone and typed a short message to Aaron. This clause reads differently in translation. It changes who carries the delay responsibility. Across town, Aaron's phone buzzed on his desk. He read Becky's message carefully. Then he opened the document she referenced. His legal team had approved the translation earlier that week. Yet when Aaron compared the sentences side by side, he noticed the same detail Becky mentioned. The change was subtle, but it shifted risk. Aaron tapped the desk with his fingers thoughtfully. This was the third document Becky had flagged since she started reviewing the files. Each time the wording was technically correct, but the structure leaned slightly against his company's interests. Aaron leaned forward again and opened another report. Something about the pattern bothered him. The stalled negotiations, the altered contract language, and the earlier attempt to manipulate the restaurant agreement. Individually, each issue could be explained, but together they created a troubling possibility. Someone might be influencing multiple negotiations at the same time. Aaron's phone buzzed again. Another message from Becky. This section, too. The translation softens a condition that protects your side. Aaron read it slowly. Then he sent a short reply. Good catch. Across Brooklyn, Becky stared at the document again. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside the window. She had started helping Aaron simply because she enjoyed analyzing language. But now something about the work felt different. Patterns were appearing. The same kind of language shifts she noticed in the restaurant were appearing in other agreements. Not identical, but similar enough to raise concern. Becky folded her arms and looked at the stack of papers. If someone did this once, she murmured quietly, they might try it again. Meanwhile, Aaron stood near the window of his office watching the city below. 3 negotiations had stalled. Confidential details from one proposal had somehow reached a competitor earlier that morning, and now Becky was identifying unusual wording inside other agreements. Aaron understood what that combination could mean. Someone in the business world was still trying to undermine his company, and the strategy wasn't limited to a single meeting. It stretched across multiple negotiations. Aaron turned back toward his desk slowly. One detail bothered him more than the rest. The people responsible for these negotiations had access to information most outsiders wouldn't see, which meant the problem might not be entirely outside the company. Someone with knowledge of Aaron's plans could be influencing events from within the business environment itself. Across the city, Becky finished reviewing another page. She circled a final sentence and set the pen down. A strange feeling settled in her chest, because the more documents she reviewed, the clearer one idea became. Her interruption at the restaurant hadn't just exposed a mistake. It had interrupted something that was still unfolding, and whoever started it might already know she was involved. The following Monday morning, Aaron arrived at his office earlier than usual. The city outside was just beginning its daily rhythm. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue, and the first wave of employees entered nearby buildings carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Inside Aaron's office, the lights were already on. A stack of printed reports waited on his desk. He had received them late the previous night. Aaron sat down and began reading carefully. The investigation into the failed restaurant deal had continued over the past several days. His legal team had been examining more than just that single contract. They started comparing it with other agreements Aaron's company had negotiated over the past year. At first, the review looked routine, but as the team studied older documents, a pattern slowly emerged. Aaron read the highlighted sections again. The wording in several past agreements contained similar structures to the manipulated clauses Becky noticed. Subtle phrasing shifts, small adjustments in responsibility, language that seemed harmless on the surface, but created pressure on Aaron's company if certain conditions changed. Aaron leaned back in his chair. The restaurant deal had not been the first attempt. It had simply been the most obvious one. He continued reading the report. The legal analysis went deeper. If those agreements had been signed exactly as written, several outcomes could have unfolded over time. Missed delivery timelines, financial penalties triggered by small delays, operational pressure created by sudden contractual obligations. Individually, none of those outcomes would destroy a company, but together they could create something dangerous. Aaron closed the report and stared out the office window. Reputation, that was the real target. If enough agreements created operational problems, investors would begin asking questions. Confidence would drop, and when confidence drops in the business world, something predictable happens. Investors become nervous. Shareholders lose patience. Competitors see opportunity. Aaron stood and walked slowly across the office. The plan became clearer the longer he thought about it. The manipulated contract at the restaurant would have accelerated the process dramatically. If Aaron had signed that deal, the delivery timeline alone could have placed enormous strain on his company's logistics network. Missing that deadline would trigger penalties. Penalties would weaken financial performance. Weak performance would reduce investor confidence. And once confidence started dropping, the final step would become easy: a buyout. Aaron returned to his desk slowly. Someone was trying to push his company into a position where it looked unstable, not through a single attack, through a chain of carefully placed pressures. Aaron opened the last page of the report. His legal team had summarized the conclusion clearly. The translator from the restaurant meeting had only been one piece of the strategy, a tool used to accelerate a much larger objective. Aaron tapped the paper lightly with his finger. Someone wanted his company, not through competition, through pressure. And the goal was simple: drive the value down, then buy it, cheap. Aaron leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The realization was unsettling, but it also answered several questions that had bothered him during the past week. Why negotiations had suddenly stalled, why certain confidential details seemed to leak into the market, why several agreements contained language that placed unusual pressure on his company's obligations. All of it pointed in the same direction. Someone had been building this situation for months. The restaurant meeting had simply been the moment when the plan almost succeeded. Aaron thought about Becky. Her decision to speak up had disrupted the timing of that plan. Without her interruption, the manipulated contract would already be signed, and the chain reaction might already be in motion. Aaron stood again and walked toward the window. The morning sun reflected off the glass buildings across the street. Somewhere inside this network of negotiations, investors, and corporate competitors, someone believed they were very close to forcing Aaron's company into a weak position. But the situation had changed, because the trap had been exposed earlier than expected. Aaron returned to his desk and picked up the phone. There was one person who needed to see the report, not because she worked for his company, but because she had already proven she could notice patterns others overlooked. Across Brooklyn, Becky was sitting at the small kitchen table again, with another set of documents spread out in front of her. Her pen rested on the paper while she studied a sentence carefully. When her phone buzzed beside the table, she glanced at the screen. "Aaron," she answered. "Morning," she said. Aaron's voice sounded thoughtful. "I think we just discovered something important." Becky straightened slightly in her chair. "What kind of important?" Aaron looked down at the report on his desk. "The contract at the restaurant wasn't the beginning," he said. Becky frowned. "What do you mean?" Aaron spoke slowly. It was only one step in a much larger plan. The words hung in the air between them, and Becky suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Her decision to speak up that night hadn't just prevented a bad agreement. It had interrupted a strategy someone had been building for months. Later that afternoon, Becky sat at the same kitchen table where she had been reviewing documents for the past week. Sunlight filtered through the window, falling across the scattered pages in front of her. Most people would have found the paperwork exhausting. Long paragraphs, complex legal phrasing, technical language describing logistics agreements and international delivery schedules. But Becky approached the pages differently. She didn't read them the way lawyers did. She read them the way someone studies the structure of language, looking for patterns, hidden meanings, small details that change the intention of a sentence. Her pen rested lightly in her hand as she studied another paragraph from one of Aaron's older contracts. At first, the wording seemed harmless, but something about the phrasing felt familiar. Becky leaned closer to the page. The clause described delivery adjustments if a supplier experienced delays. The sentence looked ordinary, but the structure of the translation reminded her of something she had seen earlier. Becky flipped back through the stack of papers beside her. Several pages rustled as she searched. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved quickly between two documents. The first was the contract Aaron nearly signed at the restaurant. The second was an agreement from several months earlier. The sentences were not identical, but the structure was almost the same. The translation softened one responsibility in both documents. The original German phrasing placed equal accountability on both companies, but the translated version shifted most of that responsibility toward Aaron's company. Becky leaned back slowly in her chair. That could not be coincidence. She studied both pages again carefully. The same type of shift appeared again in another paragraph, and another. It wasn't just similar wording, it was the same translation pattern. Becky reached for her phone. Aaron answered almost immediately. "Did you find something?" he asked. Becky held the two documents side by side while speaking. "I think so." Aaron waited. "The clauses in the restaurant contract," she continued. "They aren't new." Aaron frowned slightly in his office. "What do you mean?" "I've seen the same translation pattern before," Becky explained. Aaron straightened in his chair. "Where?" "In one of your earlier agreements." Aaron opened his laptop quickly. "Which one?" Becky read the contract date printed at the top of the page. "This agreement is from 8 months ago." Aaron's fingers paused above the keyboard. 8 months? "Yes." Becky glanced down again at the paragraph she had marked earlier. "The structure is almost identical," she said. "The German text splits responsibility between both companies." "And the translation?" Becky sighed quietly. "The translation shifts most of the pressure onto your side." Aaron leaned back slowly. That meant the manipulation was not limited to the recent negotiation. Someone had been adjusting contract language for months. Aaron spoke carefully. "You're sure it's the same pattern?" Becky didn't hesitate. "Yes." Aaron opened the archived contract Becky mentioned and began comparing the sections. The similarity became obvious almost immediately. The phrasing followed the same structure Becky described. Not identical wording, but the same subtle shift in meaning. Aaron stared at the screen. "If this happened 8 months ago," he said quietly. Becky finished the thought. "Then the restaurant deal wasn't the beginning." Aaron nodded slowly. "It was just the moment they pushed harder." Becky folded her arms as she looked at the documents again. "They've been setting this up for a while," she said. Aaron's mind began reconstructing the timeline. Several stalled negotiations during the past year, unexpected financial pressure during one quarter, minor contract disputes that required time and resources to resolve. At the time, those problems looked like normal business complications. Now they looked different. They looked connected. Aaron spoke again. Someone has been adjusting agreements long enough to create pressure across multiple contracts. Becky nodded. And if those agreements all shift responsibility toward you? Aaron finished the thought. My company eventually carries the blame when things go wrong. The strategy was becoming clearer. If enough agreements placed pressure on Aaron's operations, delays and penalties would begin accumulating. Investors would see instability. Confidence would drop. And competitors would position themselves as better alternatives. Aaron leaned forward again. Months, he said quietly. They've been working on this for months. Becky stared at the documents spread across the table. And the restaurant meeting was supposed to speed everything up. Aaron nodded. That deal would have forced us into a delivery schedule that almost guaranteed penalties. The realization settled heavily between them. Someone had invested time, planning, and patience into weakening Aaron's company, and the entire strategy had been moving quietly through contract language. Aaron rubbed his forehead slowly. One interruption changed the timing, he said. Becky understood what he meant. Her decision to speak that night had exposed the manipulation earlier than expected, which meant the people behind the strategy might now realize their plan had been discovered. Becky looked down at the marked pages again. We're not just looking at a bad translation, she said quietly. Aaron nodded. No, he closed the laptop slowly. We're looking at a long-term strategy. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Becky said something thoughtful. If someone planned this for months, Aaron looked up. They won't give up easily. Aaron leaned back in his chair. That's what worries me. Because now the situation had changed. The trap had been discovered earlier than planned. And whoever designed it would soon realize that Aaron was no longer walking toward it blindly. The game had shifted, and both sides now understood that something much bigger was at stake. Aaron spent most of that evening sitting quietly in his office. The documents Becky identified were still open on his desk. Several contracts, several translated clauses, and a timeline that stretched back nearly a year. For the first time since the restaurant meeting, Aaron felt something unexpected. Clarity. The situation no longer looked like random complications or business misfortune. It looked like a strategy, and strategies had weaknesses. Aaron stood up and walked slowly toward the window overlooking the city. Traffic lights flickered along the avenue below, and the movement of cars created long streams of white and red across the streets. Someone believed his company was slowly moving toward financial pressure. Someone expected him to react defensively, but Aaron understood something about strategy. The most powerful move was not always resistance. Sometimes the strongest response was patience. He picked up his phone and called Becky. She answered after the second ring. Did you figure something out? She asked. Aaron smiled faintly. I think so. Becky waited. If someone spent months building this situation, Aaron continued, then they expect certain reactions from me. Like what? Panic, Aaron said calmly. Public disputes, contract cancellations, defensive decisions. Becky nodded quietly on the other end of the phone. That would show weakness. Exactly. Aaron returned to his desk. So I'm not going to react the way they expect. Becky leaned back in her chair. What does that mean? Aaron opened one of the contracts Becky had marked earlier. It means we continue negotiations. Becky blinked. You're serious? Yes, but the clauses are designed to pressure your company, she said. Aaron nodded. That's true. He paused before continuing. But those clauses only work if they remain hidden. Becky understood immediately. If you know they're there, you can change how the agreement is structured. Aaron smiled. Exactly. He leaned forward slightly. We adjust our strategy quietly. How? We allow the other side to believe their wording still works, Aaron explained. But we restructure the surrounding terms. Becky thought about that for a moment. You mean changing delivery timelines, payment structures, operational responsibilities? Aaron nodded. Yes, without drawing attention to the manipulation itself. Right. Becky sat quietly for a second. The plan made sense. Instead of confronting the sabotage directly, Aaron would continue negotiating while carefully removing the pressure points hidden inside the agreements. The people behind the plan would believe everything was progressing normally. Meanwhile, the trap would slowly lose its power. Becky spoke again, and if they keep trying to push those clauses? Aaron gave a quiet laugh. Then they reveal themselves. because every time the other side insisted on specific language, it would confirm which clauses mattered most to them. Becky looked down at the documents on her table again. So instead of exposing the trap immediately, Aaron finished the thought. We let them show us how it works. The strategy felt almost like a chess game. One side believed they were guiding the board, but the other side had begun studying the moves. Aaron closed the contract folder slowly. From this point forward, he said, every negotiation gets reviewed twice. Becky smiled slightly. Once by lawyers, and once by someone who reads language the way you do. Becky laughed quietly. I didn't expect to become part of corporate strategy. Aaron's tone softened slightly. You're not part of the company, but you helped expose something important. Becky looked down at the marked pages in front of her. I just noticed patterns. Aaron nodded. And those patterns might save the company. For the first time since the investigation began, the situation felt slightly more balanced. Aaron was no longer reacting to events. He was shaping them. The negotiations would continue. The agreements would move forward. But this time, the language inside those contracts would be examined far more carefully. And if someone tried to push the same manipulations again, they would unknowingly expose exactly how the sabotage had been designed. Aaron looked out the window again. The city lights stretched across the skyline as night settled over Manhattan. Somewhere inside the network of companies competing for control of logistics routes and distribution agreements, someone still believed their strategy was working. They believed Aaron's company was slowly moving toward pressure and instability. But the reality had changed. The trap had been discovered. And now the board had shifted. Before we continue to the final turning point of this story, take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy stories about courage, truth, and the unexpected moments that change lives, make sure to subscribe to the Mr. Graham family. Because the next part of this story reveals what happens when the people behind the sabotage finally realize their plan is no longer working. And by then, it will already be too late. 2 weeks later, Aaron walked into another negotiation room. This time, the meeting did not take place in a quiet restaurant. It happened inside a glass conference room overlooking Manhattan. The view stretched across the skyline where buildings stood shoulder to shoulder under a pale morning sky. Aaron placed a thin folder on the table and sat down calmly. From the outside, the meeting looked ordinary. Another agreement, another business discussion. But the circumstances were completely different from the night Becky interrupted the restaurant meeting. Aaron knew exactly what he was looking for now. Across the table sat representatives from the same network of companies connected to the earlier negotiations. Their expressions were professional, confident, almost relaxed. From their perspective, the situation still appeared favorable. During the previous weeks, several negotiations involving Aaron's company had continued moving slowly. Requests for clarification, revisions to contract sections, careful discussions about timelines. Everything looked normal. But inside those negotiations, Aaron had quietly changed several details. Every contract now passed through multiple reviews before reaching the table. Legal protections were inserted into delivery agreements. Operational responsibilities were clarified line by line. And every translated section was checked carefully before any discussion began. Aaron opened the folder. The documents inside looked almost identical to the previous versions the other companies had seen. But the hidden pressure points had been removed. The clauses designed to shift responsibility onto Aaron's company no longer carried the same power. Several sections had been rewritten in ways that balanced the obligations between both sides. Anyone reading quickly might not notice the difference, but the outcome had changed completely. Aaron looked across the table and began reviewing the agreement with calm precision. The discussion moved through timelines, distribution plans, and logistical coordination. Everything sounded exactly like the type of conversation he had been having for years. But now Aaron listened differently. He watched for reactions. Every time a specific clause appeared in the conversation, he noticed how the other side responded. At one point, a representative paused while reading a particular section. Aaron recognized the paragraph immediately. It was the same type of clause Becky had warned him about weeks earlier, except now the wording had been rewritten. Responsibility was balanced. The trap no longer existed. The representative read the sentence twice before continuing. Aaron noticed the hesitation. That small pause confirmed something important. Someone at the table expected that clause to create pressure, but now it didn't. The conversation moved forward. Several more sections were discussed carefully. The other side tried to steer the discussion back toward delivery obligations. Aaron calmly pointed to the updated language already included in the agreement. Clear, balanced, final. By the end of the meeting, the structure of the contract looked very different from what had originally been proposed weeks earlier. Aaron closed the folder slowly. The negotiation had reached its final stage. One last review. One final confirmation of terms. Across the table, the representatives looked slightly less confident than when the meeting began. Because something had changed. The pressure points they expected to use no longer existed. Aaron understood the moment clearly. The strategy designed to weaken his company depended on hidden obligations inside the agreements. Without those clauses, the entire plan collapsed. Aaron stood and extended his hand across the table. The agreement moved forward. But this time, it was balanced, fair, and free of the manipulations that had been hidden in earlier versions. When the meeting ended, Aaron stepped out of the conference room and walked toward the elevator. He felt a quiet sense of relief, not because the negotiation succeeded, because the strategy behind the sabotage had failed. The trap that had been carefully built over months had finally collapsed, and the people who expected Aaron's company to weaken under pressure had just lost the leverage they were counting on. Aaron stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, he thought about the moment when everything began. A quiet restaurant, a contract on the table, and a waitress who refused to stay silent. Without that moment, none of this would have unfolded the way it did. Aaron reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. There was one person he wanted to call before the day continued. Becky. Because the final negotiation had just ended, and she deserved to know exactly what had happened. Becky was halfway through her evening shift when her phone vibrated inside the pocket of her apron. The restaurant looked much like it had the night everything started. Warm lights reflected across polished tables. Conversations floated quietly through the room. Plates moved steadily from the kitchen to waiting guests. Becky balanced a tray on one hand and placed a glass of water in front of a customer before stepping back toward the service station. Only then did she check her phone. Aaron. She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hey, she said quietly, stepping into the hallway beside the kitchen. Aaron's voice came through the phone with a calm energy she recognized immediately. The meeting just finished. Becky leaned against the wall. And Aaron took a slow breath before replying. The agreement went through. Becky smiled without realizing it. That sounds like good news. It is, Aaron said. He paused before continuing. The clauses that were causing the pressure are gone. Becky nodded slowly. So the trap didn't work? No, Aaron replied. It didn't. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Becky pictured the conference room Aaron must have just left. Stacks of documents. Executives studying pages carefully. Conversations moving back and forth across the table. It felt strange knowing that small details she noticed at her kitchen table had influenced those negotiations. Aaron broke the silence. You free later tonight? Becky raised an eyebrow. Depends. On what? On whether this conversation involves more contract analysis, she said with a quiet laugh. Aaron chuckled. No contracts tonight. That's promising. I'd like to talk in person, Aaron said. Becky glanced toward the dining room where customers were finishing dinner. My shift ends in about 40 minutes. I'll meet you outside. Becky hesitated briefly before answering. All right. 40 minutes later, Becky stepped out of the restaurant into the cool night air. The streets of Midtown still buzzed with movement. Taxi lights passed through the intersection. Pedestrians hurried along sidewalks carrying briefcases and backpacks. Aaron stood near the curb with his hands in his coat pockets. He looked up as Becky approached. Good timing, he said. Becky smiled slightly. You sound like the meeting went well. Aaron nodded. It did. They started walking slowly down the sidewalk together. For a few moments, the city noise filled the silence between them. Then Aaron spoke again. I've been thinking about something. Becky glanced at him. That usually means an interesting conversation is coming. Aaron laughed softly. Probably. They crossed the street and continued walking along the block. Aaron stopped near a small park bench and turned toward her. The work you've been doing with those documents, he said. You mean reading contracts at my kitchen table? Yes. Becky shrugged. I just pointed out things that looked strange. Aaron shook his head slightly. It was more than that. Becky looked curious. How? You didn't just translate language, Aaron explained. You understood how the wording affected the structure of the deal. Becky folded her arms. That's how contracts work. Aaron nodded. Exactly. He paused before continuing. And that kind of awareness is extremely rare. Becky looked at him carefully. So where is this conversation going? Aaron smiled slightly. Toward a question. Becky waited. Aaron spoke plainly. How would you feel about helping with negotiations full-time? Becky blinked. That sounds like a job offer. Aaron shook his head gently. Not charity. I wasn't thinking that. I know, Aaron said. But I want to be clear. He stepped closer to the bench. You helped uncover a strategy that could have cost my company millions. Becky looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. That night in the restaurant? And everything after that, Aaron said. Becky leaned back against the bench rail. You already have lawyers and consultants. Yes, Aaron replied. But they think like lawyers. And you think I don't? Aaron smiled. You think like someone who studies language. Becky laughed quietly. That's a strange compliment. It's an accurate one. Aaron continued. International negotiations depend on meaning, tone, and interpretation. And you catch those details instinctively. Becky considered the idea for a moment. You're serious about this? Aaron nodded. I am. She looked out toward the traffic moving along the avenue. Her life for the past few years had been simple. Work the evening shift. Read articles late at night. Watch conversations unfold from the sidelines. Now Aaron was offering something completely different. You're asking a waitress to help negotiate international contracts, she said slowly. Aaron shrugged lightly. I'm asking someone observant to help protect my company from hidden language. Becky looked back at him. And you trust me to do that? Aaron answered without hesitation. You already did. The words settled quietly between them. For the first time since they met, Becky realized something important. Aaron wasn't offering her an opportunity because he felt grateful. He was offering it because he believed in her ability, and that made the decision feel different. Becky smiled slightly. Well, she said, that definitely sounds more interesting than my current job. Aaron laughed. I was hoping you'd say that. A week later, Becky walked through the front door of the Midtown restaurant again. The room looked exactly the same as it had the night everything began. Soft lighting glowed across the polished tables. Quiet conversations filled the air. Glasses clinked gently as servers moved between guests. For Becky, the space felt strangely different now. Not because the restaurant had changed, because she had. She stood near the entrance for a moment, letting the familiar atmosphere settle around her. It was the same place where she had spent countless evenings carrying trays, greeting customers, and listening to conversations she was never meant to be part of. And it was also the place where one decision had quietly altered the direction of her life. Aaron was already seated near the same corner booth where their first conversation began. When he saw Becky approaching, he stood and smiled. Good evening, he said. Becky laughed softly. You sound like one of the hosts now. Aaron pulled out the chair across from him. Old habits from too many business meetings. She sat down and glanced around the dining room. You picked the same table. Aaron nodded. It seemed appropriate. Becky rested her hands on the table. I've been thinking about that night a lot, she admitted. Aaron leaned back slightly. So have I. A server passed by with a tray of drinks while the restaurant continued its usual rhythm. For a moment, both of them watched the room quietly. Then Becky spoke again. You know something strange? Aaron looked at her. What? That moment when I interrupted your meeting, she said. At the time it felt like a small thing. Aaron raised an eyebrow. A waitress interrupting $1 million negotiation is not usually considered small. Becky smiled. I didn't think about the money. Aaron nodded. I know. That's why I said something. Aaron folded his hands on the table. You were the only person in that room who heard the truth clearly. Becky shrugged slightly. I just understood the language. Aaron shook his head. It wasn't just language. Becky looked curious. What do you mean? Aaron leaned forward. You recognized the meaning behind the words. He paused briefly. And that changed everything. Becky glanced toward the large window beside their table. The lights of Midtown reflected against the glass, stretching across the street outside. I keep wondering what would have happened if I stayed quiet, she said. Aaron answered immediately. I would have signed the contract. And then? Aaron gave a small laugh. Then my company would probably be dealing with problems we didn't understand yet. Becky looked back at him. So a sentence stopped that. Aaron smiled slightly. One honest sentence. The moment felt calm, not dramatic. Just two people sitting at the same table where something important once happened. Aaron reached for the glass of water in front of him. You know what I remember most about that night? He said. Becky tilted her head. What? Aaron repeated the words slowly. Sir, your translator is lying. Becky laughed quietly. That's still the most awkward thing I've ever said to a customer. Aaron shook his head. It's the most valuable sentence anyone has ever said to me during a negotiation. Becky raised an eyebrow. That's a pretty high compliment. Aaron leaned back again. It's also true. For a few seconds the restaurant noise filled the silence between them. Then Becky asked a thoughtful question. Do you think people realize how much power small moments can have? Aaron looked around the dining room. Most of the guests were focused on their own conversations, business discussions, dinner plans, weekend travel. I think most people don't notice those moments until later, he said. Becky nodded slowly, like realizing that one choice changes everything. Aaron smiled. Exactly. He gestured lightly toward the table. If you hadn't said something here. Becky finished the thought. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Aaron laughed softly. That's true. The waiter arrived and placed 2 menus on the table. Aaron thanked him before turning back to Becky. So, he said, ready for your first week reviewing international negotiations? Becky smiled. I'm still getting used to that idea. Aaron lifted his glass slightly. Well, it all started right here. Becky nodded. Because someone told the truth. Aaron raised the glass a little higher. And because someone was brave enough to say it out loud, they clinked their glasses gently. A small sound in a quiet restaurant, but the meaning behind it carried far beyond that table. Because sometimes the most important moments in life don't arrive with warning. They happen in ordinary places, during ordinary conversations, when someone decides to speak honestly even when it feels uncomfortable. And that single moment can change the direction of 2 lives at once. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who believes honesty still matters. Because sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. Before you go, I want to ask you something simple. If you had been Becky in that moment, would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed quiet? Be honest in the comments, because that one decision is what changed everything in this story. And if you believe honesty still matters even when it's uncomfortable, share this story with someone who needs that reminder today. You never know whose life might change because someone chose to tell the truth.